All right, you just finished your World War II test. Now we're gonna go into the atomic bomb portion of it. I know some people, I could definitely very easily put this into the World War II test, but I kind of decided to go against that. Eventually, this will springboard us into our next unit when we come back from spring break. All right. So anyway, as we talked about before, last week, we talked about how after the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Battle of Okinawa, on how we started this bombing raid, this bombing campaign, where we basically were bombing Tokyo and bombing cities in Japan. We'll do some more reading about this tomorrow in class. But again, we were heavily, as you guys see by the slides here, heavily bombing Japan with our B-29s from February to May of 1945. The worst of the fire bombings began, in March. So 1,700 tons of bombs dropped. 16 square miles were destroyed. Over 100,000 were killed. 1 million left homeless. So it got to the point by the end of World War II, over half of Japanese cities were destroyed. This cut. So ultimately, what this is going to do, it's going to cut the Japanese war production in half, destroy their factories, kill a lot of the workforce. So this is why the atomic bomb, highly controversial. Obviously, what the bomb is capable of in terms of death totals, but ultimately, some people question, well, was the atom bomb really necessary? Did you really have to use it? We were already successfully using bombing campaigns already in Japan. It got to the point where the population was already running out of food. Um, Militarily, they could not keep up with the Americans in terms of production. The writing was on the wall in terms of the end. Now, again, there's other points. There's counterpoints to those two, as we'll get into. All right, so now we'll talk about the building of the atomic bomb. Now, to make this perfectly clear to you guys, the atomic bomb was not meant for Japan. It was meant for Germany. And we'll get to that here in a minute. But ultimately, nuclear energy started. It started in the 1930s, where scientists began to split uranium. They used uranium atoms, and they would split those atoms, causing this big, huge combustion, this big, huge explosion. And the scientist's name was Enrico Fermi. He discovered this energy can be used to create explosives, and ultimately leading to nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. However, it won't be until the late 1930s where a scientist by the name of Albert Einstein, he fears, and he writes a letter to FDR in 1939, and he warns FDR that the Germans are already developing and starting nuclear energy. And ultimately, he fears, in his letter to FDR, he fears that if Hitler gets this weapon first, which they're already beginning the early stages of it, that could be an extremely dangerous thing. Now, again, one of the big mistakes by Hitler, as we talked about in the class already in our World War II unit, there were plenty of mistakes that he made. But one, because of his anti-Semitic viewpoints towards Jews, a chunk of Jewish German scientists are going to flee in the 1930s. Again, before the war even breaks out, and during the war, and they're going to go to places like Great Britain and the United States, and ultimately, you know, Germany loses, some of the brightest minds are going to flee to Western democratic nations. Um, so because FDR kind of heeded the warning of Albert Einstein, the United States, we developed our own nuclear program, and we disguised it as the Manhattan Project. And we'll start this in December of 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor. And the lead scientist and researcher who's going to kind of head this program is going to be a guy by the name of Robert Oppenheimer. And this is going to be a top secret information. And it really, guys, it's to the point where only select people in the U.S. government actually know about this. I mean, heck, our own vice president had no idea. President Truman, as we'll get to him later on, he had no idea that we were even doing this. So this was like a completely need to know basis, top secret. We had underground facilities and university labs that were being used to make pieces and parts of the weapon. And obviously, if you were a part of the Manhattan Project, most people, not all, some of the people working for it didn't. They were building components of the bomb. Didn't exactly know what they were building, because there's so many pieces that go into a bomb, especially this kind of weapon, that people really didn't know what ultimately it was going to be used for. But there were facilities in the mountains in Washington. There were things in Tennessee. You had things in New Mexico. So like a very remote, top secret areas where they had some of these labs. So it won't be until July of 45. So again, going back to this, we started in 41. We don't finish the atomic bomb until July of 1945. Now, think back to what we talked about earlier in the week. Uh, Germany is going to surrender in May. So again, as I said before, we intend for this weapon to be used against Germany, but Germany drops out of the war, they lose, they surrender. So now Japan. Japan is still in the war. Now, again, as before, we've been firebombing them. We've been having these bombing campaigns, but they have not yet surrendered. So we have this Trinity test. This was the first test of the A-bomb. This is in Los Alamos, New Mexico. This is going to be the beginning of the nuclear age. So when we launch this first atomic bomb, the nuclear age is going to begin, especially when we use it against Japan in war and we display it to the world. Guys, think about it. We have this mega weapon that can be used to kill hundreds of thousands of people like that. So when we have it, we become like the top dog. We become like everybody's scared of us essentially because we have this mega weapon. Well, guess what? Other countries are going to develop this weapon too. That's what starts happening. We enter this nuclear age, the nuclear arms race, where countries begin to mass produce, stockpile these weapons, and we'll get to that here with the Cold War unit as we talk about after our spring break. But this weapon was so powerful, 20 kilotons of TNT. You could see the fireball was a mile wide, 8 miles high. So just a massive thing that you couldn't even, grasp the magnitude of this. The flash from the atom bomb could be seen over 180 miles away. That's how powerful this thing was. All right, so we have the Trinity test now. Okay, now at this point, as we talked about, FDR passes away. So now President Truman, he's now informed about the Manhattan Project. So in July, at the Potsdam Conference, Truman is at this conference with Stalin and Churchill, the new big three. And during this conference at Potsdam, Truman gets word that the Trinity test was a success, that the atom bomb worked. So at this conference, at the Potsdam Conference, they were meeting to finalize plans for after the war. Okay, so what are you going to do to Europe? What are you going to do to Germany? What are the war crime trials going to look like? So obviously, you've seen the most heinous acts in human history in terms of what the Germans did to Jews, what the Japanese did to POWs, and in China. So we started developing. Okay, well, what are the war trials going to look like to make people pay for their war crimes? So July 21st, they agree that we should use the bomb. The big three are informed about we have this weapon, and they agree that it should be used. Now, they finally chose the sites of the atom bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, there's reasons for why we chose these two cities. We chose them because really these two cities were untouched during our bombing campaigns. Remember how in the first slide, those bombing campaigns that we had? These two cities were untouched. So if you have a weapon that you drop from the sky and you detonate on a city that has not been touched, you can truly, and this sounds kind of bad, guys, it really does. I feel even icky even saying it. But if you drop two bombs on these cities that were untouched, you can it's almost like a science experiment. It's kind of what it was. They wanted to see exactly radiation levels. They wanted to see the damage that this bomb could cause, the crater, all these things. They wanted to use it as basically, as I said, a test to collect data. So that's why these two sites were used. So fast forward to August 6th, 1945, we dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. A B-29 bomber. They nicknamed it the Enola Gay airplane. The pilot was Paul Tibbets. Dropped the atomic bomb. They nicknamed the bomb Little Boy at 8:15 a.m. And instantaneously, within like that, 80,000 die in the first day, and over the grand total of the days afterwards, when it gets to radiation burns, etc., 140,000 will die shortly after. Now, that's a rough estimate. Now, as we'll get to, Lots of things that, they truly don't know an exact number because a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later, you start getting these cancers that start developing in Japan from the radiation. So radiation poisoning, leukemia, cancers, burns, etc., are gonna plague this city for years afterwards. Some bodies are gonna just vaporize like that. The heat of the atom bomb is gonna be so much heat that basically you're just gonna melt. Your flesh will basically just rip right off you. So after this, the Japanese still don't surrender. 2 days later, August 8th, the Soviet Union will declare war on Japan as promised from the Potsdam Conference. They'll agree to enter the war after this first bomb dropped. So you see the pictures here, some of the devastation, the cloud, the Enola Gay, Paul Tibbets is there in the middle. And then finally, after 3 days of not surrendering, we drop another bomb on Nagasaki. It lands a little bit off target, or else it would have killed more people, but 40,000 died on the first day, 80,000 total again. Same thing as the last one, rough estimates, cancers, etc., many, many years later can be contributed to it. The nickname of the bomb was called Fat Man. It was dropped from the B-29. And eventually, 6 days later, the Japanese will surrender. And September 2nd, 1945, we accept their terms, and it's Victory in Japan Day, VJ Day. So, aftermath. 55 million people dead worldwide. 16 million U.S. soldiers were served in the war. 320,000 killed in World War II. Now, ultimately, why did the Allies win the war? You can't really point to anything else other than leadership. I mean, FDR, Winston Churchill, Truman deciding to drop the atom bomb, the sacrifices of men and women, the men and women and citizens that helped make this happen in terms of war production, the resources that we had, the production, our industries back at home was a huge part of it. Our ability to outproduce anyone in the world was paramount. Hitler decided to open up that two-front war with Operation Barbarossa. Big mistake. And then ultimately, what happened afterward? What happened to Japan? U.S. forces are going to stay in Japan under MacArthur's command for 7 years, but we will allow, as part of the deal, we will allow Emperor Hirohito to stay in power, because then he's seen as a godlike figure there, and we felt like citizens were more apt to buy in if he stayed there. So the U.S. will write their constitution for them. However, we won't have a military that won't be allowed in Japan for a while. To this day, they only have a small number of defense forces. We helped reshape their government. We turned it into a constitutional monarchy with basic freedoms and universal suffrage, so allow all people to vote, allow basic, democratic principles, free speech, etc. We put it into a free market economy, so we did a lot of changing and tweaking to their style of government, and ultimately the war crimes trials in Tokyo. 1,100 former Japanese soldiers and officials were tried and sentenced. We did capture Hideki Tojo, and he will be executed along with 6 top other officials. All right, so other than that, that is it, guys.